to sign in. Thanks for those who have joined so far. We're just going to wait just another couple of minutes. Looks like we're about halfway through in terms of participation numbers based on those who have RSVP'd to this evening's webinar. So just for those who are waiting patiently, please just give us another 1 to 2 minutes. Okay, I think we'll make a start. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's Addressing Deforestation and Peatland Protection and Conservation. Thank you all for taking the time to join. As you're aware, deforestation and peatland protection and conservation are topics which are high on the agenda of the RSPO and have been a focal part of the Principles and Criteria review over the past 18 months. Before I introduce the speakers and panelists, I'd just like to share some details with you about how this webinar session will work. As and when participants join, they're automatically set to mute so as not to interfere with the speaker or conversations that are taking place. If you wish to ask a question at any stage throughout the call, please type in the question box. Please note, we may not be able to answer all of your questions on the call today. However, we'll be capturing the questions and hope to be able to provide you with a response within the next few days via email. The structure of today's call will allow for 10 minutes of presentation from each speaker on their respective topic, followed by 20 minutes of questions and answers. This session will be recorded and will be shared with all registered participants. I'd now like to introduce today's speakers. We have RSPO PNC Taskforce member, Jenny Walther, the Senior Policy Officer, Sustainable Biomass and Standards of WWF, Belinda Howell, Retailers Palm Oil Group Representative and fellow RSPO PNC Taskforce member, and Faisal Parish, Director of Global Environment Centre, Co-Chair of RSPO Peatland Working Group 1 and 2, and Co-Chair of the Emissions Reduction Working Group, and PNC Task Force member. Faisal will be commenting on any technical elements today, but I'd now just like to pass to Jenny, who will be the first speaker to discuss the topic of deforestation. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you very much and welcome everybody. I would like to show you in the next 10 minutes the new criteria about 712 for halting deforestation in forests and other areas in the PNC review. So next slide. And the next one. The new criteria is really an integration of requirements for the identification, maintenance and enhancement of high conservation values and the protection of high carbon stock forests. So we haven't lost anything from the old PNCs where we had already a comprehensive set of indicators for the identification, maintenance and enhancement of high conservation values, but we included now the high carbon stocks as the go-to-go tool for the protection of forests on a global level. And with the new structure of the whole standard, we also integrated the criteria, the old criteria 5.2 for existing plantations and 7.3 for the new plantings. That you will see in the whole standard that now the requirements for existing plantations and the requirements for new plantings are combined in one criteria. So it is easier to understand, really clear what I have to do. Next slide. So, next slide, please. Do I get the next slide? Yeah. The criteria, the goal of the criteria is really clear. It's to halt deforestation in HCVs and in high carbon stock forests. That's the one side of the model. The other side is that there is also a clear need to balance the possibilities for development, for community livelihoods in forests, and also especially for high forest cover countries and communities living in high forest cover countries and areas. So you all know that there is a heavily debate on how to balance protection of forests or protection of habitats with the need of economic development in the different areas of the world. And with the new PNCs, we are trying to support one possible way to do this. And we are thinking that with the integration of the high carbon stock assessment and methodology, we have done a big step in the right direction. So the new criteria 712 is land clearing does not cause deforestation or damage any area required to protect or enhance high conservation values or high carbon stock forests. HCVS and HCS forests in the managed area are identified and protected or enhanced. That's the criteria, and we have 8 indicators in this criteria, which then describe in detail what you should do to fulfill this criterion. And beside the clear point, so don't deforest, it's also, and that's for me also a very big step, we also included now more and more the ideas about a landscape approach in this criterion. But only to protect a patch of forest is not enough to really enhance high conservation values, biodiversity, wildlife. So we all know that we need bigger landscapes, we need landscape considerations to really enhance our biodiversity on the plantations and outside of the plantations. So in the new criteria 712, also landscape thinking is included with a guideline what it could mean, and it is also included what you have to do, which tools you have to use to identify HCS forest, high carbon stocks forest, high conservation values, and also how to deal with communities and local rights holders in your identified areas. So, next slide, please. Okay. The new element, or the big new element, and this criterion is clear, the high carbon stock approach. The high carbon stock approach has developed a toolkit and a combined HCV HCA assessment manual. And these 2 tools are now integrated as tools in the RSPO standard. So these two tools will be used to identify areas of high carbon stock forests and HCVs, and also give guidelines how to maintain them and how to enhance them. So we really include these tools in the standard so that it's clear for everybody how to do this. Next slide. Perhaps you are also aware that the high forest carbon toolkit and the manual is dedicated to fragmented forest landscapes in Southeast Asia. So we do have a gap what we are doing in high forest cover countries, in areas like in Africa or also Papua New Guinea, where the till now piloted and tested methodologies are not really fit in the regional and local circumstances in those areas. So we have, as an RSPO task force, after a long discussion with a lot of external stakeholders included, decided to go for a stepwise approach, if you like to say it. So you find in the PNCs a relatively clear set of indicators that say what you have to do in fragmented forest landscapes. And then to say that in high forest cover landscapes, we will work together with the HCSA to review and to define more regional adapted approach. And this will include guiding principles for local communities, how to conduct limited oil palm development, what are so-called legacy cases, that means plantations or licenses which are already there and already have planted and are now a little bit stocked, and the different discussions and the different definitions of what you can do or what you should not do in these areas, but also clear to take into consideration regional and national multi-stakeholder processes, so that not we in Europe or in Asia decide what Africa or like Gabon or Ghana has to do, so that we are really working together with the regional stakeholders and the national stakeholders to find an adapted process. Next slide. A very short definition what it means, high forest cover country. It's over 60% forest cover, under 1% oil palm of the total land base. We have an historical low but increasing deforestation trajectory. It's clear we are talking here about the new frontiers in deforestation for palm oil and other commodities. A landscape, then it's clear it's smaller, and for a high forest cover landscape, we're talking about landscapes which have more than 80% forest cover. I think land clearing is clear. So what will be the next step for this process? There will be a joint steering group with the wonderful name No Deforestation Joint Steering Group. And the terms are now discussed and written in collaboration with HCSA. This joint steering group between RSPO and HCSA will then, in a 2 years time frame, I'm really hoping solve the problems and bring in clear guidance and transparent frameworks how to have a sustainable palm oil development in high forest cover countries. And the terms of reference will be publicly available. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll now open the floor to questions. As I mentioned earlier, if you can please type all of your questions into the question box, and we will try our best to get to all of them.
No question.
Yeah, no, there is. I can ask. I can read them out to you, Jenny, if that helps. So one of the questions here is: Are the HFC countries identified, and what's the criteria?
So the criteria is the definition what I said before. Also a country which have over 60% forest cover and under 1% palm oil on the agricultural space. And the high forest cover countries are not finalized, but there is an indication. For example, Gabon is in, Papua New Guinea is in, Solomon Islands. Only as examples.
Yeah, that was another question. Someone was asking for clarification on the statement on PNG. So I think maybe you've just answered that.
Yeah, so Papua New Guinea would be considered as high forest cover country. West Papua and Papua provinces in Indonesia are not high forest cover country, while Indonesia as a whole is less than 60% forest cover and much more than 1% palm oil on the agriculture base. But it's the status now. Like I say, that it's not a finalized process, and we are starting now the process.
Okay, thank you. Okay, yes, we had another question, a couple of people asking that same question, so I won't repeat. There's a question here saying, the HCSA previously had a working group for HFC countries, but no adaptation was agreed. How is it different this time?
That's a very good question. So first of all, HSA really recognized that they have to provide a solution for high forest cover countries. Second, we have a joint working group, and as RSPO, our goal is to see sustainable palm oil development for all parts of the world, and not say, okay, we will not look in areas where perhaps it's a little bit more difficult than in other areas. So we will have a new dynamic in the group. And I think we will also have other members, so I hope in the end we will come to a practical solution. And we are including regional and national stakeholders in the discussions, so that the voices of the people which are really living in these areas are also heard.
Okay, and there's a question from someone asking, who is eligible as a member of the NDJSG?
In the terms of reference, it's written that this will be a decision from the RSPO board. Sorry, Belinda, perhaps you have it in mind. So there will be a clear process how the members are defined, and the different stakeholder groups are equally will be equally presented in the working group.
Okay, and another question is, what is the basis to define greater than 60% as HFCC?
Yes, that's a question that we get very often. The idea or the methodology behind you can also find on the RSPO website. There is the study from Consultant for Forest published, where consultants had looked for us as a Taskforce member on the different methodologies and also studies which already have been published and done to define what could be high forest cover and what could be criteria how to define it. In the end, we decided as a task force to adapt one of the proposed definitions, and that's the over 60%.
Thanks, Jenny. There's another question here. How is the HFC procedure going to work in the interim if the joint steering group is going to take 2 years to reach decision on procedure?
In the interim, it's clear written that the combined HCS, HCV manual and assessment has to be used in the toolkit.
Okay, there's just there's a comment from someone saying if you can please turn off your microphone when you're not speaking. I think there's some heavy background noise there. Okay, another question here is, what if in 2 years we do not reach an agreement?
I don't think about it. I'm so sure that we will reach an agreement that I hope we don't have to think about it.
Okay, sorry, there's still a few questions coming in. How are HFCC data going to be kept up to date as forest cover percentages are already out of date? Will the HFCC countries change over time?
Yes, I would say yes, it will change over the time. I really hope that we can halt deforestation so that we have to halt deforestation rates in all countries, but clear countries are living organisms, so there will be changes. And we will also see if this definition is the right one, or over the next 2 years or over the next time, we will see if this is the right definition, or we have to find another definition, or a definition which is more flexible also. Like I said, it's a journey, yeah, and we have begun we are starting this journey, and how we will end up, it's not 100% clear yet. But we all know, and I think we are all very committed to have a good result in the end, where we know that we cannot wash our hands from it. So we have to find together a solution what we are doing in high forest cover landscapes.
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions. If anyone else has anything that they want to add, please type it in the question box at this point. There's another one here though, Jenny. I think it's not fair if the allocation is by country. It's more fair if HFC is by area, province.
Yes, there is a debate about it, if we should looking only to landscape or provinces or to countries. In the task force, our consensus was that we are first looking on countries. In the end, it's about stopping deforestation, and we have with the combined HCV-HCS tool a very good tool for fragmented forest landscapes in Southeast Asia, and it was the overall opinion that it will not be a good way to open up the process for all provinces again to decide if they are high forest cover or not. So we should really concentrate this already difficult discussion in the few cases where the province and the deforestation problem and the high forest covers that we have are concentrated, and not have a process where we are getting hundreds of discussion on provincial level. This is deforestation and this is not deforestation.
Sorry, Jenny, we're just having a little bit of feedback. I'm not sure if perhaps your phone nearby. Oh. Jenny, are you still there? Jenny, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, there's just, I'm not too sure, perhaps is your mobile phone near the microphone, near your laptop?
I'm using my phone.
Sorry?
I'm using my mobile phone.
Oh, okay. Perhaps. Okay. I think we'll have to close this session for now because there's a lot of feedback. So sorry for those who have just added in the last couple of questions, but I'm also getting comments that people are struggling to hear. So I think with that, we will move on to the next topic. So perhaps Belinda, if you could take the floor now. And thanks again, Jenny.
Hi, it's Belinda speaking. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear, thanks.
Great. Welcome everyone. I've been asked to talk about peatland protection and conservation in the soon-to-be revised P&Cs, and I've been a member of the Taskforce, the P&C Review Taskforce doing that, and there was quite some feedback, particularly from constituents that I represent on the retailers, wanting strengthened requirements on peat. So I think that might be why I've been asked to present on the new criterion. I have Faisal also as a panelist as backup because I'm certainly not the technical expert on peat. So I'm very grateful to Faisal for joining as well. And between us, we'll try and answer any questions you have. Okay, so next slide, please. We have a new criterion, 7.7, which provides strengthened requirements for the protection, conservation and sustainable and responsible management of peatlands. What this does is integrate portions of former criteria, 4.3 and 7.4. The reason for that is the same reason as Jenny explained on deforestation. In the revised P&Cs, we've, instead of having two separate principles for existing and new plantations, those requirements have been combined, so they're all together in one place rather than in two entirely separate principles. So just as for no deforestation, this meant we had to revise how we set out the requirements on peatland protection and conservation for both existing and new plantations. So going on to the next slide, the actual wording of the new criterion reads, there's no planting on peat regardless of depth after the date of the General Assembly, and all peatlands are responsibly managed. That's the actual text of the criterion, and underneath it there are 7 indicators detailing exactly how that protection and conservation of peatlands is to happen. So in the subsequent slides, I'm going to focus just on the several aspects which have been either further developed or enhanced compared to the 2013 P&C. Okay, so next slide. The first big area for kind of enhancement in these is looking at peatland subsistence. And as we all know, I think peatland subsistence has proven to create long-term challenges for continued agriculture due to inevitable land subsidence. And this leads to a lowering of the land surface, whereby natural drainage by gravity then can't occur, and often increasing flood risk. So these changes in land levels give rise to considerable economic, social and environmental impacts. So to avoid extensive loss of land or costly initiatives to mitigate the social and environmental impacts caused by this subsistence, the 2013 P&C actually already introduced the need for a drainability assessment prior to replanting. However, the detailed methodology for that drainability assessment was not specified in the RSPO Best Management Practice Manual in 2012. So a formal drainability assessment procedure has now been developed by the RSPO to address this gap, and this will help quantify the current and future potential risks of increased flooding in existing planting on peat, and should be conducted ideally at least 5 years prior to replanting. So we're putting some really long-term signals in here. So the drainability assessment results should be used to set then the time frame for future replanting, as well as phasing out of oil palm cultivation, 40 years or 2 cycles, whichever is greater. And there's a typo there in the presentation. It should be read whichever is greater, before reaching the natural gravity drainability limit for peat. So when oil palm is phased out, after these 2 cycles or greater, it should be replaced with either alternative, more water tolerant crops or rehabilitated with natural vegetation. And if flood risks are found to be high, indicating that the area is unsuitable for replanting, then rehabilitation back to a natural state, or implementation of alternative forms of utilisation, such as polyculture. So we have some really long-term signals about the drainability assessment and what has to happen as a result of those drainability assessment findings. So going on to the next slide, all existing plantings on peat have to be managed according to the RSPO Manual on Best Management Practices for existing oil palm on peat and associated RSPO audit guidelines. Also, all unplanted and set aside peatlands are protected and managed in accordance with the latest RSPO Manual on Best Management Practices for management and rehabilitation of natural vegetation associated with oil palm cultivation on peat. We don't go in for short titles in the peatland world, but it's just important to note that the Peatland Working Group has developed audit guidelines to assist in the auditing of these 2 indicators, so that the auditing is against specific requirements in the best management practice manuals and not 100% of the content of those best management practice manuals. So this gives greater clarity to both growers and auditors on, exactly which are the critical issues to be audited on. And I think this is in line with what we are trying to do in the revised P&C throughout, which is to make what are the normative requirements that have to be audited really clear, much clearer than perhaps they were in the past. So that will be done through those auditing guidelines. Next slide is on the continuous improvements, continuous efforts for continuous improvement. The Peatland Working Group 2 continues to work. They've updated both best management practice guidelines, manuals, and those will be published by January 2019. The drainability assessment procedure will be a separate procedure to be finalised by early 2019, and a further refinement after 1 year once we've seen how that's working in practice. And then collaboratively, RSPO will develop relevant guidance for independent smallholders with the smallholder interim group. So this is the group that is looking at the new standard for smallholders, for independent smallholders in the P&C review, and that's coming along behind and following the main P&C review. So the Peatland Working Group 2 will be working collaboratively with that SHIG group, as we like to call it. We do like our acronyms as well in this world. So that's the smallholder interim group. Final point to make, the final sort of change that's been made, is that the Peatland Working Group 2 announced in August 2018 a revision to the definition of peat. So there is a separate, more restrictive definition for Indonesia and Malaysia, that reflects the fact that RSPO has been using this narrow definition since 2011 and follows national regulations and classifications in Indonesia and Malaysia. So this is being applied to existing plantations on peat in these two countries. So, oh, sorry, next slide, please. I'm on the definition of peat. Thank you. This new definition, which is up there, as I say, has been advertised and announced since August 2018 on the RSPO website. But for management of existing plantations in Malaysia and Indonesia, the national specific definition is recognised, which is soil with an organic layer of more than 50% in the top 100 centimetres of soil containing more than 65% organic matter. So the broader definition, which is shown here, the peat is soil with cumulative organic layers comprising of more than half of the upper 80 centimetres or 100 centimetres of the soil surface containing 35% or more organic matter or 18% or more organic carbon. That broader definition is used for new plantations in these countries and the rest of the world, so drawing on the accepted FAO definition of organic soils. The reason for this is that many peatlands in other parts of the world actually have a high proportion of mineral content due to their occurrence in lake basins or river floodplains. So this is in line with FAO guidance on management of tropical peats. The broader definition is more appropriate in these cases. I'm not sure if that is about as clear as mud or peat, but hopefully Faisal can help explain if that is not clear. And I think that's my final slide. So open the floor. Maybe first to Faisal, if you want to provide any further clarity on anything I've presented, and then to any questions.
Hello, this is Faisal.
Thanks, Faisal and Belinda. We're just waiting for a couple of questions to come through. So if anyone on the webinar at this point has any questions for Belinda and Faisal, please use the question box to type the questions in there.
And I can already see one question which is super important. It said that planting on peat, regardless of that, what about the replanting? Is it okay for replanting? No, this applies to existing and new plantings and replanting. Hence the drainability assessment, and hence the much clearer long-term signals about what happens as a result of the drainability assessment procedures.
So maybe can I add something on this issue? And there's one specific question I've received directly. That is about the period of 5 years. So for the drainability assessment, it is stated that the drainability assessment should be ideally be undertaken 5 years prior to the planned replanting. And what is the reason for that 5 years? Basically two issues. I think that there is also other requirements in RSPO that companies should have like a rolling 5-year program to specify the replanting periods anyway. So they should be identifying in advance when they're going to do replanting. And secondly, because replanting on peat will only be possible where the result of the drainability assessment indicates that there are not likely to be serious problems with flooding or saline intrusion within a buffer period set at 40 years. And this is basically to take a precautionary approach that we need to have this buffer because of rising sea levels, increasing flood levels, as well as to allow for any fluctuations within the particular site. So there's this precautionary buffer period which is put, and then we are saying in the guidelines that in the PNC that people should not wait till the last minute, so the last 6 months before they want to replant, before they undertake the drainability assessment. So undertake that 5 years before, see what the result is, and if anything, adjust management of the existing site, for example, to reduce the rate of subsidence, then that will affect the future result. Of course, then prior to the actual planting itself, then you would need to rerun the assessment based on the new subsidence information if you've improved the water management, and then that would be the basis for the implementation. So all of this somewhat complex detail will be spelled out in the RSPO drainability assessment procedure, which will be made available early next year.
Thank you for that, Faisal. There's a question here saying, is the national definition accepted?
I think this relates to national definition of peat. So actually in the existing, for the existing plantations in Indonesia and Malaysia have basically been developed using national definitions. And that is included, I think, as you could see on the bottom of the slide. So Peatland Working Group and RSPO basically have agreed that for the existing plantations, that at the time they were developed and that they're managed, they were delineated based on those national definitions, which in some cases have been referred to in national interpretations, but also the previous RSPO definition was based on basically Indonesia and Malaysia definitions. Now, because we're looking worldwide and we're taking a precautionary approach for the future developments, we want to avoid disputes over minor clarification or definitions of peat. And basically for new plantations, we're wanting to have this more standard one derived from the internationally accepted FAO and US Department of Agriculture definitions for organic soils. In some regions already, in Latin America and many African countries, that already is the definition used for peat. In some other countries, they have split between peat and muck soils. But for the future, to have a precautionary approach for new developments, RSPO is specifying that this broader FAO classification is used.
Yes, Sarah, could you move the presentation back one slide to the definitions slide, which Faisal was just referring to? There it is. So the broader definition, the FAO one, is the one in larger lettering in the main presentation, and then below you've got the existing plantations in Malaysia and Indonesia to continue to use the national specific definitions.
Okay, there's a question here saying, seems like very tight requirements. Wouldn't this inadvertently allow for bad companies operating in other commodities to develop where good RSPO companies cannot develop? How is this risk addressed?
That's a good question. Faisal, do you want to have a go at that?
I mean, I think this applies to anything RSPO is dealing with, not only particularly for peatlands. So I think any of, for example, no deforestation or others. Of course, if there are those companies that non-RSPO companies, of course, RSPO cannot bind them by RSPO procedures. But RSPO, I believe, is, I mean, we all agree is aiming to create, one could say, a higher standard, an internationally recognized standard. And that may mean that there are certain areas which would not be developed by RSPO. And I think in the whole process of developing the new P&C, I think we got, for the future of no planting on peat, I think there was almost out of thousands of comments, there was not really a single significant comment saying no, RSPO should allow development on peat. So I think that that is already a very clear consensus amongst the RSPO stakeholders and others that RSPO should not be developing on peat. Now, obviously, if RSPO is not developed, if other commodities develop, I'm sorry, RSPO cannot control that. And RSPO should not weaken its standard to allow all peat to be developed for oil palm and classify it as sustainable to prevent the possibility of other commodities developing it. So I think we are making choices in RSPO and setting proper standards, credible standards to be accepted by market, and therefore we cannot weaken the standard to consider possibilities of other commodities being developed on those land. That's something that needs to be developed by the government, and in countries like Indonesia, government have already put in place very strong requirements, basically not allowing further development on most of the peat areas.
Thanks for that, Faisal. There's another question here saying the definition of Malaysia and Indonesia is quite different with the general definition. So basically, the plantation in Indonesia that considers non-peat may be a peatland as per the general definition. For this case, do those plantations, or should those plantations consider to implement BMPs on peat, or it will be okay for them as those are not defined as peatland as per the national definition?
I'm going to ask Faisal to help me out here again. You're reaching the limits of my technical knowledge.
Okay, so this is something that the Peatland Working Group will look into. So, so we're talking about soils in Indonesia and Malaysia that are having between 35 to 65% organic matter. From our initial estimation, that may be equivalent to maybe in Malaysia an additional 10% of area compared to the area on peat. So it's not a vast area. These in Malaysia, they're referred to as muck soils. They have a higher mineral content, but they also have a very high carbon content, in that carbon or greenhouse gas emissions may be quite significant. So the Peatland Working Group has not yet come with specifications for this type of soil, but it's something that we will consider, and maybe included some guidance in the final version of the Best Management Practice Manual, or as a separate manual. So these soils are in a gradation, and some are relatively shallow or very shallow soil, and they may be peat areas classified as peat before more than 50 centimeter, which are becoming shallower over time due to loss of the organic matter. So the Peatland Working Group will look into it and come up with guidance, but at this stage we are not specifically stating that there needs to be any particular management practice for them, but that on further study there may be some guidance on that, but maybe to a lesser degree of detail compared to the requirements for peat soils.
Thank you, Faisal. There's another question here. Will RSPO define soil test requirements in the future on carbon and content?
I guess another one for me. We are actually, we have focused particularly on this organic matter, and you can see in that definition the methodology that we are proposing for the testing is 35% or more loss on ignition. This loss on ignition test is very appropriate for organic soils and is actually relatively cheap compared to other methods of determining carbon content or organic matter content. So it's a relatively easy, relatively cheap, very robust methodology. And we are specifying and we're giving details in the guidance from the group, but we're not proposing that more sophisticated things would be mandatory. Of course, company at their own discretion can look at other tests as well.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple of questions sort of surrounding the definitions. So just to clarify, someone is asking, does this mean existing plantations, even if they are not planted in Malaysia and Indonesia, will use the national definition?
My understanding, I mean, really existing plantations means already planted. So only the existing plantations which are already planted would follow that national definition. They have been developed based on that national definition and delineated as such and reported as such already. So if there are portions of those areas which are not planted, then they cannot be planted. So that is the over requirement of no new planting of peat. So even if it's within an existing concession block, but it's not planted or has not been planted, under the new P&C, it cannot be planted. So I hope that makes it clear. There are not gaps or areas just because it's in an existing concession but not planted, it can be planted. So that's quite a firm requirement of no new planting on peat. The only exception is replanting. That means areas already planted before, provided that the information comes from the drainability assessment about the long-term avoidance of flood risk, then those areas may be replanted.
Okay, and another question here, how are these peat soils going to be identified at a site level?
Well, I think that all companies undertaking any assessment, if it's a new site, all companies will be undertaking reconnaissance and or semi-detailed soil surveys, and then they will identify using the basic soil assessment approach. So it is a requirement for all RSPO companies at the moment that they must prepare soil maps and soil assessments prior to the development and use such maps in designing their development area. So I don't think we're not going to spell out exactly how you do your soil surveys. There is plenty of professional guidance on that. We're only just commenting on the definitions to be used for the identification of those areas zoned as peat.
Thank you for that. Okay, we'll just have one last question. What will be the auditable element?
If we're talking, as I think Belinda introduced, that we have the best management practice manuals. For those who are familiar with the existing manuals, the best management practice for cultivation on peat is 220 pages long. And the best management practice for maintenance of vegetation associated with oil palm on peat is 150 pages long. So instead of saying the whole, every page of that is going to be audited, so the Peatland Working Group have developed an audit guidance note where we have tried to focus in for each of the indicator, I think between 3 to 5 key elements which will be focused on through the audit process, so that this is very transparent between the audit companies so undertaking the audit and the growers themselves, so everyone understands fully, and so there are not conflicts over whether, for example, part of the best management practice includes examples and case studies and so on. Those are not meant to be audited against. It's the practice of the company. So this is already available in draft form and will be finalized and included as an annex within the BMP manuals, really to focus on what elements would be the focus of the auditing. And that particularly for the 2 new indicators related to the best management practice manuals, that is quite key. For the other indicators for the drainability, there is the drainability assessment procedure, which will specify minimum requirements. And then the other ones which relate to having proper maps, having made those available, having proper water and subsidence monitoring and management processes. Again, we have given specific guidance, so to help the transparency and understanding and avoid the confusion in the auditing process.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Faisal. As we're approaching the end of this session, I just want to ask any speakers who have presented today if you have any last points that you'd like to make. If we have missed any questions, please feel free to add them into the question box now, just before the end of this session, and we'll try and get back to you via email within the next few working days. So Faisal, Jenny, or Belinda, do you have any last comments that you'd like to add?
I think I'd just add, it's Belinda speaking, I'd just add really a huge thanks, particularly to Faisal and the Peatland working group, because they have been doing a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes that enabled us to get to this very, much strengthened but very clear new or revised criterion for managing of existing and new plantings and replantings on peat. So a huge congratulations and thank you to the Peatland Working Group is due, definitely.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, Faisal.
Yeah, so I think just as the next step of the Peatland Working Group, once the BMP manuals are prepared, audit checklists are prepared, other information on drainability is prepared, then we'll be rolling out together with RSPO Secretariat a series of training programs for the companies, but as well as the auditors, so that everyone has a common knowledge and understanding, and so that will be very smooth for the implementation for the future.
Thank you. Okay. Well, I think if that's all there is, and if there's any other questions, as I mentioned, please just add that to the question box now. Otherwise, I'd like to say a big thank you to Jenny, Belinda, and Faisal for hosting this evening's webinar session. We do hope that everyone found it to be interesting and informative, and thank you very much for joining. And we'll be sending the recorded version of the webinar at a later stage. So thank you very much once again for joining, and we'll speak to you again soon. Thanks.